The sound of his laughter was what finally broke the spell. It wasn't a chuckle of amusement, but a sharp, dismissive scoff that cut through the low, refined hum of Le Bernardin's dining room. It was the sound of a man who believed he had just discarded a worthless lottery ticket. Derek leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk playing on his lips, his eyes sweeping over her simple, off-the-rack dress with undisguised pity. "You have to understand, Eleanor," he had said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm moving up in the world. And you? You're just standing still." He laughed as she stood up to leave, entirely unaware that the woman he was throwing away owned the very building he was sitting in. The evening had started with the kind of stiff, suffocating tension that usually precedes a disaster. Eleanor sat across from Derek at a corner table of Le Bernardin, New York's crown jewel of seafood dining. She had felt out of place the moment she walked in. It wasn't because of the Michelin stars or the hushed, cathedral-like reverence of the waitstaff. It was because she had spent the last 3 years meticulously cultivating a life of calculated mediocrity. Tonight, she was wearing a $40 Zara dress and a pair of sensible flats, playing the role she had perfected. Eleanor Wells, the struggling freelance illustrator who lived in a cramped walk-up apartment in Astoria. Derek, on the other hand, was dressed for the life he desperately wanted. He wore a rented Tom Ford suit that pulled slightly at the shoulders, a knockoff Rolex Submariner peeking out from his cuff. He was a junior analyst at J.P. Morgan, a man suffocating under the weight of his own ambition. For 3 years, Eleanor had loved him. She had paid the lion's share of their rent when he was an unpaid intern. She had cooked late-night meals, proofread his frantic emails, and believed in the man behind the relentless corporate striving. But tonight, Derek's eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely detached. He didn't look at her. He looked through her, checking the entrance every few minutes. "The yellowfin tuna carpaccio is exquisite, Derek," Eleanor offered, trying to bridge the cavernous silence between them. Derek barely glanced at his plate. "It's fine. Listen, Eleanor, we need to have a serious conversation." Her heart did a familiar, sickening roll. She placed her fork down, the silver clinking softly against the fine china. "Okay, what's wrong?" he sighed, the kind of heavy, exaggerated sigh of a parent dealing with a slow child. He adjusted his cuffs, making sure the fake Rolex caught the ambient light. "I'm up for an associate position next month. It's highly competitive. The partners at the firm, they look at everything. Your portfolio, your connections, your lifestyle. They look at who you have on your arm at the charity galas." Eleanor kept her expression neutral. "And I don't fit the bill?" "Look at you, Eleanor," Derek said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You're sweet. You really are. But you have zero drive. You're 25, making pennies drawing logos for local coffee shops. I'm entering a world of high net worth individuals. I need someone who understands that world. Someone with pedigree." Before Eleanor could process the sheer audacity of his words, a shadow fell over their table. "Derek, I thought that was you." Eleanor looked up. Standing there was a woman who looked like she had been grown in a laboratory, specifically designed to produce Manhattan socialites. She wore a silk slip dress by the row, a genuine Cartier love bracelet on her wrist, and an aura of bored entitlement. Derek stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the plush carpet. "Chloe, what a wonderful surprise. I didn't know you were dining here tonight." "Daddy's treating," Chloe said, waving a manicured hand toward a private dining alcove. Her eyes flicked to Eleanor, assessing and dismissing her in a fraction of a second. "And who is this?" "This is Eleanor," Derek said quickly, his tone shifting into something smooth and obsequious. "She was just leaving." Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. She was just leaving. The betrayal wasn't just a knife to the back. It was a public execution. Chloe Harrington. Eleanor recognized the name instantly. Her father, William Harrington, was a mid-level real estate developer who had recently made headlines for a lucrative commercial deal in Hudson Yards. To Derek, Chloe wasn't just a woman. She was a stepping stone, a golden ticket to the partners' table. "I see," Chloe purred, her gaze lingering on Eleanor's unbranded purse. "Well, Derek, don't be a stranger. Daddy mentioned he might need some financial advisory on the new Brooklyn project. Come by our table when you're finished here." As Chloe walked away, leaving a trail of Baccarat Rouge, 540 in her wake, Derek sat back down, his face flushed with triumph. "So that's it?" Eleanor asked, her voice dangerously quiet. 3 years, Derek. 3 years of supporting you, and you're trading me in for a networking opportunity." "Don't be dramatic, Eleanor," Derek scoffed. "It's basic economics. You're a sunk cost. Chloe is an appreciating asset. What can you possibly offer me? Love? Love doesn't buy a penthouse on the Upper East Side. Love doesn't get me into the Hamptons. You're holding me back." Eleanor looked at the man she thought she knew. The desperation in his eyes, the pathetic hunger for validation from people who would never truly accept him. "You're making a massive mistake, Derek," she said, her voice steady. That was when he laughed. It was a loud, ugly, barking laugh that drew the eyes of the tables nearby. "A mistake?" he sneered. "What are you going to do, Eleanor? Draw a really angry cartoon about me? Go back to Astoria. Take the subway. I'll cover the bill. Consider it a severance package." Eleanor didn't cry. There was no dramatic slap, no screaming match. She simply stood up, picked up her modest coat, and walked away. She kept her spine perfectly straight, her chin parallel to the floor, moving with a sudden, aristocratic grace that seemed entirely at odds with her inexpensive clothes. As she pushed through the heavy revolving doors of Le Bernardin and stepped out onto 51st Street, the cold November rain hit her face. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by a deep, resonant anger. Not just at Derek, but at herself. For 3 years she had lived a lie. Her real name was Eleanor Sinclair. She was the sole heir to Sinclair Global Holdings, a conglomerate with tentacles in everything, from international shipping to luxury hospitality, and, ironically, the majority landlord for most of Midtown Manhattan's premium commercial real estate, including the building Derek was currently dining in. When Eleanor had turned 22, freshly graduated from Yale with a degree in business, she had watched her peers fall into miserable marriages of convenience, merging trust funds rather than hearts. She had seen the sycophants, the gold diggers, the fake friends who only saw her as a human ATM. Desperate for something real, she had begged her father, the notoriously ruthless billionaire Richard Sinclair, for 3 years of anonymity. 3 years to live as a normal person, to find a partner who loved her for her mind and her spirit, not her family's offshore accounts. Richard had hated the idea, but he had yielded. 3 years, Eleanor, he had warned her in his oak-paneled office overlooking Central Park. But the world is a cruel place to those without leverage. Don't be surprised when the wolves bare their teeth. He had been right. Derek was a wolf, and a remarkably cheap one at that. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through her thin coat. A yellow cab sped past, sending a spray of dirty street water onto her ankles. She stood under the awning of an empty storefront, shivering, feeling the absolute absurdity of the situation. She had endured cheap takeout, roach-infested apartments, and the crushing anxiety of living paycheck to paycheck, all to prove that true love existed without money, and her reward was being dumped for a woman whose father's net worth was less than what the Sinclairs spent on philanthropy in a fiscal quarter. Eleanor reached into her pocket. She didn't pull out the cracked iPhone she used for her Eleanor Wells persona. Instead, she unzipped a hidden compartment in her purse and withdrew a sleek, encrypted satellite phone. It was a direct line she hadn't used in 36 months. She pressed a single button. It rang only once. "Miss Sinclair," a crisp, refined British voice answered immediately. It was Arthur, her father's fiercely loyal chief of staff. "Arthur," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of any warmth, "the experiment is over." There was a microsecond of silence on the line, the only indication of Arthur's surprise. "Understood, ma'am. Are you in need of immediate extraction?" "I'm outside Le Bernardin. It's raining, Arthur, and I am incredibly tired of pretending." She paused, her eyes narrowing, as she looked back down the street toward the glowing windows of the restaurant. Inside, she could just make out Derek, leaning over Chloe Harrington's table, laughing like a court jester. "Send the car." "And Arthur?" "Yes, Miss Sinclair?" "Tell my father I'm ready to take my seat on the board." "He will be profoundly pleased to hear that, ma'am. ETA is 4 minutes." Eleanor hung up. She crossed her arms against the chill, her posture transforming. The timid, accommodating Eleanor Wells was dead, washed away by the New York rain. In her place stood Eleanor Sinclair. She didn't feel heartbroken. She felt an icy, terrifying clarity. Derek wanted a world of high-net-worth individuals. He was about to find out what happens when you insult the apex predator of that very ecosystem. She waited under the awning, watching the city move around her. The minutes ticked by. Then, the rhythmic flow of traffic on 51st Street began to warp and change. Inside the restaurant, Derek Hayes was having the best night of his life. After Eleanor's pathetic, silent exit, he had smoothly transitioned to the Harrington table. William Harrington, a stout, red-faced man who loved the sound of his own voice, had taken a liking to Derek's aggressive sycophancy. "So, Derek, you're at JP. Morgan?" William asked, swirling a glass of 1998 Chateau Margaux. "We're looking for aggressive young blood to help structure the debt on the new Brooklyn waterfront acquisition. The current terms we're getting from Goldman are frankly insulting." "I can absolutely run some models for you, sir," Derek said smoothly, ignoring the fact that he was vastly underqualified for such a task. He caught Chloe's eye and offered a charming, conspiratorial smile. "I believe in bespoke solutions for visionary projects." William chuckled. "I like you, kid. You've got hunger, unlike half the trust fund babies in this city who don't know the value of $1. Suddenly, a strange murmur rippled through the dining room. Le Bernardin is a sanctuary of discreet wealth. Its patrons are accustomed to celebrities, politicians, and Wall Street titans. It takes a monumental disruption to break the decorum of the room. But the murmur was growing into a collective gasp, heads turning toward the floor-to-ceiling windows at the front of the restaurant. Derek frowned, turning in his chair to look outside. The rain-slicked street had been effectively shut down. 3 massive matte black Cadillac Escalades had swerved into the lanes, blocking traffic with military precision. But it was the car in the center that commanded absolute silence. It was a custom, midnight blue Maybach 62S, a vehicle so long and imposing it looked less like a car and more like a land yacht. "Good Lord," William Harrington muttered, setting his wine glass down. "Who the hell has the pull to block 51st Street? Even the mayor can't do that." Derek watched as 2 men in impeccably tailored dark suits stepped out of the lead Escalade. They weren't regular security. They moved with the hyper-alert, lethal grace of former special operators. One of them jogged to the rear of the Maybach and opened an umbrella, while the other opened the heavy, armored passenger door. A man stepped out into the New York night. He was in his early 60s, with thick, silver hair perfectly swept back. He wore a bespoke Brioni suit that draped flawlessly over his broad shoulders, radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. As he adjusted his cuffs, the restaurant lights caught the unmistakable gleam of a Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime, a watch worth more than the entire net worth of most people in the room. "Is that?" Chloe whispered, her eyes wide. William Harrington's face had drained of all color. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. "That's Richard Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Global Holdings." Derek felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. He knew the name. Everyone in finance knew the name. Richard Sinclair was a leviathan. He didn't just play the market. He owned the board. "JP, Morgan, Derek's employer, managed billions in Sinclair assets. A single phone call from the man outside could dictate the fate of thousands of careers. "What is a man like that doing here?" Derek murmured, trying to maintain his composure. Outside, Richard Sinclair ignored the blaring horns of the blocked traffic. He walked past the Maybach, his security detail trailing closely. He wasn't looking at the restaurant. He was looking at a dark, shadowed storefront awning a few yards away. Derek squinted through the rain-streaked glass. Under the awning stood a woman, her back to the street, shivering in a cheap coat. Richard Sinclair walked up to her. The billionaire, known for his ruthless corporate takeovers and emotionless demeanor, did something that shocked everyone watching. He gently placed his own cashmere overcoat over the shivering woman's shoulders. The woman turned around. Derek felt the breath leave his lungs as if he had been punched in the solar plexus. The room spun. The exquisite wine in his stomach turned to acid. It was Eleanor. "No," Derek whispered aloud. "That's impossible." "Do you know her?" Chloe asked, looking at Derek in confusion. Derek couldn't speak. He could only watch in mounting horror. Through the glass, he saw Eleanor look up at Richard Sinclair. The billionaire raised a hand, gently wiping a drop of rain from Eleanor's cheek. The resemblance, once hidden by context and cheap clothing, was suddenly glaringly obvious. The sharp jawline, the piercing eyes. Outside, Richard Sinclair's expression shifted from tender to glacial. He looked at Eleanor, then slowly turned his head to look directly at the glowing windows of Le Bernardin. Even through the glass, Derek felt the weight of that stare. It was the look of a man identifying a target. "Arthur," Richard Sinclair's voice carried over the rain, though those inside couldn't hear it. "Who made my daughter cry?" Eleanor pulled the cashmere coat tighter around herself. She didn't look broken anymore. She looked regal. "No one important, Dad. Just a bad investment." "I see," Richard said softly. He gestured to the maitre d', who was already rushing out the front doors with an umbrella, bowing frantically. "We are going inside, Eleanor. I wish to see where this bad investment took place." "Dad, it's not worth—" "I insist," Richard interrupted smoothly, his eyes locked on the dining room. "No one disrespects a Sinclair and gets to finish their dinner." The heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung open, pushed by the security detail. The ambient noise of the dining room died instantly. The clinking of silverware, the soft jazz, the murmurs of conversation, all of it ceased as Richard Sinclair stepped into the foyer, with Eleanor walking right beside him. Derek tried to sink into his chair, his mind screaming in panic. "You're a sunk cost." He had actually said that to her. He had offered to pay her severance. He had told the heiress of the Sinclair empire to take the subway back to Astoria. William Harrington stood up quickly, his napkin falling to the floor, eager to seize a once-in-a-lifetime networking opportunity. "Mr. Sinclair, what an absolute honor. William Harrington, Harrington Real Estate. If I could just have a moment of your time—" Richard didn't even break his stride. He didn't look at William. He walked past the real estate developer as if he were a piece of furniture, his eyes locked entirely on the pale, sweating face of Derek Hayes. Eleanor stood beside her father, her posture perfect. She looked down at Derek, then at Chloe, and finally back to Derek. There was no sadness in her eyes anymore. Only the cold, calculating gaze of a predator who had finally revealed her true nature. "Hello, Derek," Eleanor said, her voice echoing in the dead, silent room. "I believe you were just telling me about your need for pedigree." The silence in Le Bernardin was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the climate control system and the muffled sounds of Manhattan rain against the glass. The air in the room had grown incredibly thin, as if Richard Sinclair's mere presence had consumed all the oxygen. Derek's mind scrambled for a lifeline, a joke, a misunderstanding to cling to. He looked from Eleanor's cold, unrecognizable face to the terrifying visage of her father. "Mr. Sinclair," William Harrington tried again, his voice cracking slightly as he abandoned his pride. He stepped sideways, trying to put himself between the billionaire and Derek. There must be some confusion. This young man is an analyst at JP Morgan. We were just discussing the Brooklyn waterfront. Richard Sinclair finally turned his head to look at William. The gaze was devoid of anger. It was the look of an entomologist observing a mildly annoying beetle. "William Harrington," Richard said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded the room. "You are currently over-leveraged by 42% on your Hudson Yards properties. You are seeking mezzanine financing from Goldman Sachs because traditional lenders have flagged your debt-to-income ratio as toxic. And yet, here you are, drinking a 98 Margot and taking financial advice from a junior analyst who," Richard paused, letting his eyes slowly travel back to Derek, "cannot even recognize the owner of the building he is sitting in." William's face turned the color of ash. He stepped back, physically retreating from the blast radius. Chloe Harrington, sensing the catastrophic shift in power, slowly uncrossed her legs and pushed her chair back, distancing herself from Derek as if he were suddenly radioactive. I don't understand," Derek stammered, his voice betraying a pathetic tremor. He looked at Eleanor. "Owner? Eleanor, what is he talking about? You live in Astoria. You draw coffee cups." Eleanor took a step forward. The oversized cashmere coat draped over her shoulders made her look like a judge in robes. "Sinclair Global Holdings acquired the commercial footprint of this block 3 years ago, Derek," Eleanor said smoothly. Her voice was devoid of the warmth he was used to. "The rent for this restaurant is paid to a subsidiary trust, a trust that I manage." Derek's hands began to shake. The knockoff Rolex suddenly felt like a shackle burning his wrist. "Eleanor, I didn't know. You lied to me. For 3 years you lied to me." "I didn't lie," Eleanor corrected, her tone perfectly even. "I omitted. I wanted to see if the man I loved had a spine, or if he was just a suit looking for a ladder. Tonight you showed me exactly who you are. You called me a sunk cost." Richard's eyes narrowed dangerously at the phrase. "A sunk cost. Is that right, Mr. Hayes?" "Sir, please. It was a misunderstanding. A lover's quarrel," Derek pleaded, looking around the room for help. The wealthy patrons averted their eyes. He was completely alone. "I have the utmost respect for your daughter. Save your breath," Richard interrupted, stepping closer. The 2 security operatives by the door subtly shifted their weight, ensuring no one interfered. "Let us talk about economics, Mr. Hayes, since my daughter tells me you fancy yourself a master of the universe. JP Morgan currently manages roughly $4 billion of Sinclair liquid assets. Tomorrow morning, at 9 a.m. sharp, I am initiating a transfer of those funds to Morgan Stanley." Derek felt his knees go weak. He grabbed the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. Moving a $4 billion account wasn't just a loss. It was an earthquake. Heads would roll at the highest echelons of the bank, and when they found out why the money was moving— "No, please," Derek whispered, the arrogance entirely stripped from him. "My career. They'll fire me. They'll blackball me." "Fire you?" Richard chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Mr. Hayes, they are going to wipe your name from the servers. You will not be able to get a job managing a cash register in this city. You wanted a world of high-net-worth individuals. You wanted pedigree?" Richard gestured to Chloe, who was actively looking away, her face flushed with humiliation. "You threw away a diamond to pick up a rhinestone, all because you lacked the vision to see what was right in front of you." Eleanor looked at Derek one last time. The pity she felt was fleeting, instantly replaced by closure. The man she had loved was a phantom. This trembling, cowardly shell was the reality. "Leave the bill, Derek," Eleanor said quietly. "As you said, it's a severance package." She turned on her heel, the cashmere coat swirling around her ankles. Richard placed a protective hand on the small of her back, guiding her towards the exit. As they reached the doors, Richard paused and looked back at William Harrington. "And William? If I ever see your firm's name on a prospectus crossing my desk, I will personally hostile, take over your miserable little real estate portfolio and turn your Hudson Yards project into a parking lot. Have a pleasant evening." With that, the Sinclairs walked out into the rain. The doors swung shut, and the heavy silence of Le Bernardin rushed back in to suffocate Derek Hayes. The next morning, Manhattan woke up to a grey, unforgiving sky. Derek had not slept. He had spent the night pacing his overpriced Murray Hill apartment, drinking cheap scotch and furiously refreshing his company email on his phone. He had tried calling Eleanor 63 times. All went straight to a sterile, disconnected voicemail. He had tried calling Chloe Harrington. Her number had blocked him. At 7 a.m., he put on his best suit. The real one. A Navy Brooks Brothers he saved for client meetings, and took the subway to 383 Madison Avenue, the towering headquarters of J.P. Morgan. He told himself that Richard Sinclair was just posturing. Billionaires didn't move $4 billion overnight because of a dinner dispute. There were contracts, penalties, bureaucratic hurdles. It was a bluff. It had to be. Derek walked into the soaring, marble-clad lobby, clutching his briefcase with sweaty palms. He approached the security turnstiles and slapped his ID badge against the scanner. Instead of the reassuring green beep, the scanner flashed a harsh red "Access denied." Derek froze. He tapped it again. Red. Again. Red. "Sir," a burly security guard said, stepping forward with a clipboard. "Name?" "Derek Hayes, Junior Analyst, Wealth Management. My badge is malfunctioning." The guard ran a finger down his list. He didn't look up. "Mr. Hayes, you've been flagged. You are to report directly to the 42nd floor. Visitor pass only. Escort required." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Derek's chest. The 42nd floor wasn't his department. The 42nd floor was executive management. 10 minutes later, flanked by a silent security guard, Derek stepped off the elevator into a suite of offices that smelled of rich mahogany and quiet terror. He was led into a massive corner office overlooking Park Avenue. Standing behind a sprawling desk was Jonathan Pierce, the global head of wealth management. Pierce was a legend on Wall Street, a man known for his surgical ruthlessness and a temper that could strip paint off a wall. Currently, Pierce was staring out the window, his back to Derek, holding a bone china teacup. "Mr. Pierce," Derek started, his voice barely a squeak. "Shut up," Pierce said, without turning around. The sheer venom in the two words made Derek flinch. Pierce slowly turned. His face was a mask of constrained fury. On his desk, a Bloomberg terminal blinked with rapid-fire alerts. Derek Hayes, 26 years old, state school graduate, hired 3 years ago, middling performance reviews, a perfectly forgettable, unremarkable cog in my machine. Pierce placed the teacup down with a sharp clack. "Do you know what my morning was like, Derek? I woke up at 5 a.m. to a phone call from the CEO of this bank. He was screaming. I've never heard him scream. He was screaming because at 4:55 a.m., Richard Sinclair's family office initiated a formal withdrawal of their entire portfolio. $4 billion. Derek's legs gave out. He collapsed into one of the leather guest chairs, his briefcase tumbling to the floor. "Sir, I can explain. It was a personal matter." "A personal matter?" Pierce roared, suddenly slamming both hands onto his desk, leaning over it like a gargoyle. "You insulated, arrogant little idiot! When you work here, you don't have a personal matter with the Sinclairs. You are property of this firm, and you just cost us our biggest white whale because you couldn't keep your pathetic social life in check." "He's bluffing," Derek pleaded desperately. "The penalty fees..." "Sinclair paid the penalty fees in cash at 6 a.m., Pierce yelled, spit flying from his lips. $50 million in penalties just to spite us. He doesn't care about the money, Derek. He cares about sending a message. And do you know what message he sent?" Pierce picked up a piece of heavy cardstock from his desk and threw it at Derek. It hit his chest and fluttered to his lap. It was a formal termination notice. The message was that as long as J.P. Morgan employs Derek Hayes, Sinclair Global will actively short our stock and fund our competitors. You are radioactive. You are a walking liability. You can't do this, Derek whispered, tears finally springing to his eyes. My career. My life. Your career ended at Le Bernardin last night, Pierce said coldly, straightening his tie. He pressed a button on his intercom. Security, escort Mr. Hayes out of the building. Do not let him return to his desk. Box his personal items and mail them to him. As the heavy hands of the security guards fell on Derek's shoulders, dragging him up from the chair, Pierce offered one final, devastating blow. Oh, and Hayes? I made a few calls this morning. To Goldman, Morgan Stanley, City. I told them exactly why Sinclair pulled out. You're done in finance. I hear the coffee shops in Astoria are hiring. I suggest you learn how to froth milk. Underscore, 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 underscore. Meanwhile, 40 blocks south, in the towering glass and steel monolith of the Sinclair Global Holdings building in the financial district, Eleanor stepped out of a private elevator onto the executive penthouse floor. She wasn't wearing Zara today. She wore a sharply tailored, charcoal grey Tom Ford suit, her hair pulled back into a sleek, severe chignon. The transformation was complete. Eleanor Wells, the struggling artist, had been erased. Eleanor Sinclair, the heir apparent, had finally arrived. Arthur was waiting for her in the foyer, holding a tablet. "Good morning, Miss Sinclair. Your father is expecting you in the boardroom." "Good morning, Arthur," Eleanor said, her heels clicking authoritatively against the Italian marble floors. "Status on the J.P. Morgan withdrawal?" "Completed at 6:15 this morning, ma'am. Mr. Hayes's termination was processed by their HR department approximately 4 minutes ago." Eleanor didn't smile. She didn't feel triumph, only a cold, necessary satisfaction. She had excised a tumor. And the Harrington account? Blacklisted across all our subsidiary lenders. Mr. Harrington's Hudson Yards project is currently hemorrhaging capital. He has been calling the office since 7 a.m. begging for a meeting. "Send him straight to voicemail," Eleanor ordered, pushing open the heavy double doors to the boardroom. Her father was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table, flanked by the senior executive team. As Eleanor entered, the room fell silent. Richard Sinclair looked up, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. He stood, and the rest of the board immediately followed suit. "Gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous room, "I'd like to introduce our new Executive Vice President of Acquisitions, my daughter, Eleanor." Eleanor walked to the empty chair at her father's right hand. She looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, down at the bustling, ant-like crowds of Wall Street below. She had spent 3 years down there, playing by their rules, getting stepped on by their ambitions. Never again. She took her seat, folded her hands on the table, and looked at the board of directors. "Now," Eleanor said, her voice ringing with the unmistakable authority of a Sinclair. "Let's get to work. 6 months is a terrifyingly short amount of time to lose an entire life. For Derek Hayes, the descent from a junior master of the universe to a ghost haunting the edges of Manhattan was steep, brutal, and entirely unglamorous. Wall Street is a fortress built on reputation and whispered alliances. Once Jonathan Pierce made those phone calls, Derek was not just fired, he was excommunicated. It started with the apartment. Without his J.P. Morgan salary and the anticipated associate bonus, the $6,000 a month rent on his Murray Hill high-rise became an immediate impossibility. He broke the lease, incurring a penalty that wiped out his meager savings. Next went the leased BMW M3, repossessed quietly in the dead of night. His calls to headhunters, once met with enthusiastic lunches at Del Frisco's, were now routed to generic voicemail inboxes. Word had spread through the insular networks of Apollo Global Management, Blackstone, and Goldman Sachs. Do not touch Derek Hayes. He crossed Richard Sinclair. By December, Derek was living in a damp basement studio in Hoboken, New Jersey. The knockoff Rolex had been pawned to pay for groceries, and the endless stream of dry cleaning required for his futile, humiliating job interviews at second-rate regional banks. He was 30 pounds thinner, the arrogant swagger replaced by a permanent, hollow-eyed flinch. He spent his days scrolling through the Wall Street Journal on a cracked laptop, torturing himself with the news of the world he had been violently ejected from. The headlines were merciless. Harrington Real Estate Files for Chapter 11. Sinclair, Holdings acquires Hudson Yards, debt for pennies on the dollar. William Harrington had lasted less than 3 months under the crushing pressure of Eleanor Sinclair's targeted financial embargo. Unable to secure mezzanine financing after the Sinclair blacklisting, Harrington's over-leveraged empire collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Chloe Harrington, the woman Derek had viewed as his golden ticket, had been thoroughly disgraced. Her trust fund was liquidated to satisfy creditors, her Cartier bracelets sold at auction. The last Derek had heard, she was living with an aunt in Connecticut, working a shift as a high-end retail clerk just to maintain health insurance. And then there was Eleanor. She was everywhere. Forbes featured her on their 30 Under 30 finance cover, looking sharp, unyielding, and breathtakingly powerful in a tailored Saint Laurent suit. The accompanying article detailed her aggressive, brilliant restructuring of Sinclair Global's real estate portfolio. There was no mention of the 3 years she spent drawing coffee shop logos. There was no mention of Derek. It was as if he had never existed. The silence was what finally drove Derek mad. He couldn't accept that he was just a discarded stepping stone in her origin story. In his twisted, desperate mind, he convinced himself that if he could just see her, if he could look her in the eyes and remind her of the nights they spent eating cheap Thai takeout in Astoria, he could awaken the soft, forgiving Eleanor Wells he used to control. His opportunity arrived in late January. The Sinclair Foundation was hosting its annual philanthropic gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was the social event of the winter, a gathering of billionaires, senators, and European royalty. Security would be tighter than the Pentagon, managed by a private firm composed entirely of former Israeli intelligence officers. But Derek knew something they didn't. During his brief, sycophantic conversations with Chloe Harrington 6 months prior, she had boasted about the specific catering company her father always used for high-end events, a company Sinclair Global had unexpectedly retained for the gala. Derek spent his last $200 bribing a cynical, overworked catering manager he tracked down at a loading dock in Queens. For 2 crisp $100 bills, Derek bought a generic caterer's uniform, a fake ID badge, and a terrifyingly narrow window of access. The night of the gala, a bitter, driving, sleet-battered New York City. Derek shivered in the uninsulated back of a box truck, surrounded by towers of champagne flutes and trays of beluga caviar. He wore the starched white shirt and black vest of a server, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. As the truck backed into the subterranean loading bays beneath the Met, Derek slipped out. He kept his head down, blending in with the chaotic swarm of kitchen staff, event planners, and florists. He navigated the labyrinthine concrete corridors beneath the museum, relying on a downloaded map on his phone, moving steadily upward towards the Temple of Dendur. When he finally emerged from a service elevator into the main hall, the sheer scale of the wealth on display physically winded him. The ancient Egyptian temple was bathed in ethereal blue and gold lighting. A 50-piece symphony orchestra played softly in the background. Waiters glided through the crowd like synchronized swimmers. Everywhere Derek looked, he saw the titans of the world. He recognized David Solomon of Goldman Sachs laughing near the reflecting pool. He saw the CEO of Pfizer deep in conversation with a French fashion magnate. And then he saw her. Eleanor stood near the base of the temple, holding a flute of champagne. She was flanked by her father, Richard, and Arthur. the ever-present shadow. She wore a custom, midnight blue Oscar de la Renta gown that seemed to absorb the ambient light, her neck adorned with a diamond collar that belonged in a museum vault. She was laughing, a rich, genuine sound that Derek hadn't heard in over a year. Next to her stood a man Derek had never seen before. He was tall, ruggedly handsome, wearing a classic tuxedo with effortless grace. He wasn't a Wall Street clone. He looked like someone who built things. He had his arm casually draped around Eleanor's waist, a gesture of comfortable, secure intimacy that made Derek's stomach twist with toxic, burning jealousy. Derek gripped the silver tray in his hands until his knuckles turned white. He couldn't stop himself. He stepped out of the shadows of the service corridor and began walking toward the epicenter of the room. The distance between the shadowed service archway and where Eleanor Sinclair stood felt like traversing a hostile, alien planet. Every step Derek Hayes took was heavy with the crushing, suffocating weight of his own irrelevance. He expected the private security detail to tackle him at any given second, but the sheer, brazen audacity of a waiter walking directly toward the host of the gala seemed to momentarily paralyze the room's strict social protocols. The Temple of Dendor was bathed in an ethereal aquatic light, the massive sandstone ruins reflecting off the dark, mirror-like surface of the indoor pool. The air smelled of white truffles, expensive champagne, and Tom Ford cologne. A string quartet stationed near the base of the ancient Egyptian monument was playing a hauntingly beautiful rendition of Max Richter's Spring. Everywhere Derek looked, he saw the untouchable titans of the world. He recognized Stephen Schwartzman of Blackstone deep in conversation with a European prime minister. He saw the mercurial CEO of LVMH laughing with a cluster of supermodels. This was the absolute apex of the high net worth world Derek had destroyed his life to reach, and he was standing in the middle of it, wearing a rented Olivier Cheng catering uniform that smelled faintly of kitchen grease. As he closed the gap to 20 feet, Arthur was the first to notice. The Chief of Staff's eyes, usually projecting a veneer of polite British warmth, hardened into twin chips of glacial flint. He tapped a microscopic earpiece hidden in his left ear and leaned in, whispering a single, clipped sentence to Richard Sinclair. Richard turned slowly. The billionaire did not look surprised, nor did he look angry. When his eyes locked onto Derek's pale, sweating face, the ambient temperature in their immediate vicinity seemed to plummet. Richard looked at Derek with the profound, exhausting boredom of a man who had just scraped something unpleasant off the sole of his John Lobb Oxford shoe. Then Eleanor turned. Derek stopped dead 10 feet away, his legs refusing to carry him any further. He slowly lowered the silver catering tray, his hands trembling so violently that the empty champagne flutes rattled against each other like chattering teeth. "Eleanor," he breathed. The word barely made it past his lips, a dry, ragged gasp. The string quartet continued to play, but the conversation in their immediate, hyper-exclusive circle died instantly. The sudden silence was deafening. The tall, ruggedly handsome man standing beside Eleanor raised a questioning eyebrow, his hand shifting from the small of her back to rest protectively on her waist. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply reached up and gently placed her hand flat against the man's chest, a silent, absolute signal that she had total control of the airspace. "Arthur," Eleanor said. Her voice was perfectly modulated, carrying just enough resonance to be heard over the cello, yet lacking any trace of alarm. "It appears there has been a critical failure in the vendor screening protocols." "My profound apologies, Miss Sinclair," Arthur murmured smoothly, his hand resting casually inside his suit jacket. "Extraction teams have been dispatched. They are 10 seconds out." "Eleanor, please, just give me 3 minutes," Derek begged, taking a desperate step forward. He ignored the horrified gasps from a cluster of nearby socialites. He ignored the terrifying, predatory glare of her father. "I have lost everything. Everything. My job at the bank, my apartment, my life. I haven't slept properly in 6 months. I know I was a fool. I know I was blinded by ambition and the culture at the firm. But I loved you, I really did. I loved the real you. The Eleanor in Astoria. Eleanor took a slow, deliberate sip of her Dom Perignon. The custom midnight blue Oscar de la Renta gown she wore seemed to absorb the ambient light of the room, and the cascade of flawless Harry Winston diamonds at her throat caught the flash of a photographer's camera across the hall. She looked at him not with the righteous anger he had braced himself for, but with the cold, sterile fascination of a forensic accountant examining a fraudulent ledger. The Eleanor in Astoria, she repeated slowly, tasting the syllables as if they were a foreign language. Are you referring to the Eleanor who paid your rent for 18 months while you interned? The Eleanor whose illustrations you frequently called a childish waste of time? The Eleanor you explicitly told to take the subway home in the rain while you drank a 98 Margot with a man whose bankruptcy proceedings I just finalized last Tuesday? I was stupid, Derek pleaded, tears finally springing to his eyes, hot and humiliating. He didn't care who heard him anymore. He was a drowning man grasping at a razor blade. But I've paid for it, Eleanor. I'm living in a moldy basement in Hoboken. I'm applying for teller jobs at regional credit unions, and even they won't hire me because I've been blacklisted. Isn't that enough? Haven't you taken enough of your pound of flesh? I am begging you, on my hands and knees, just make the phone calls. Tell Jonathan Pierce to lift the embargo. Let me have my life back. Your life, Richard Sinclair rumbled. The billionaire stepped forward, his massive frame effortlessly eclipsing the light from the reflecting pool. Mr. Hayes, you are currently standing in a room with people who dictate the flow of global macroeconomic policy. You are a microscopic, entirely unremarkable speck of dust on the windshield of this economy. The fact that you managed to bribe a loading dock manager to sneak in here tonight does not prove your resourcefulness. It merely proves you are a stalker with boundary issues. And Sinclair Global Holdings does not negotiate with stalkers. Please, sir, I am a good analyst. I can prove— You are nothing, Richard interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute baseline. You cost J.P. Morgan a $4 billion account because you could not manage your own grotesque ego. No reputable financial institution on this planet will ever trust you with their capital again. You are radioactive waste. Now be silent before I decide to buy the Hoboken basement you are renting and evict you onto the street. Dad, let me, Eleanor said softly, her tone carrying an undeniable authority that made even Richard pause and step back. Eleanor walked toward Derek. The soft whisper of her silk gown against the stone floor sounded like a blade being drawn. She stopped just 2 feet away from him. Up close, the insurmountable chasm between their stations in life was suffocating. She smelled of bespoke Parisian perfume and absolute power. He smelled of cheap detergent and raw desperation. Derek, do you know who this is? Eleanor asked, gesturing gracefully toward the handsome man she had been standing with. Derek shook his head numbly, his vision blurring with unshed tears. This is Thomas Sterling, Eleanor said. He is the founder and principal architect of Sterling Design Group. His firm is currently breaking ground on Sinclair Global's new Sustainable Technology and Research Campus in Austin, Texas. It is a $2.4 billion infrastructure project designed to rival Apple Park. Derek stared at Thomas, a sickening wave of jealousy mixing with sheer confusion. Why are you telling me this? I don't care about a tech campus. You should, Eleanor smiled, and it was a sharp, surgical expression that offered no warmth. Because, Derek, the foundational blueprints for that campus, the complex structural designs that secured the International UN Sustainability Award last month? She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to ensure he was hanging on her every word. I drew them, in that cramped, freezing apartment in Astoria. Derek's breath hitched in his throat. Those coffee shop logos you laughed at, Eleanor continued, her voice a deadly, quiet hum, meant only for him. The sketches you called a waste of time, The drafting papers you once spilled black coffee over because you were throwing a tantrum about a missed promotion. Those were the schematics for the largest green energy infrastructure project in North America. I wasn't wasting time drawing cartoons, Derek. I was building an empire from a folding card table while you were busy fetching dry cleaning for mid-level managers at a bank my family practically owns. The revelation struck Derek with the physical force of a sledgehammer. The art he had mocked, the quiet, focused hours she had spent sketching at the kitchen island while he aggressively and loudly networked on LinkedIn. It hadn't been a hobby. It was a multi-billion-dollar blueprint. He had been sleeping next to a generational genius, and he had treated her like an embarrassing burden. "You wanted pedigree," Eleanor whispered, stepping so close he could see the icy gold flecks in her brown eyes. "You wanted a high net worth partner to elevate your social standing. You had one. I handed you the keys to the kingdom. But you were too busy looking at the price tag on my Zara dress to recognize the staggering value of my mind. You are exactly where you belong, Derek. At the bottom. And you put yourself there." Before Derek could even process the magnitude of his catastrophic misjudgment, the air behind him shifted. Two massive men in impeccably tailored tuxedos materialized from the shadows, flanking him with terrifying precision. They didn't grab him. They didn't need to. Their mere presence was a physical wall of impending violence. "Miss Sinclair," one of the security operatives murmured, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "NYPD counterterrorism units are stationed outside. Shall we hand him over for criminal trespassing and corporate espionage?" Derek's heart plummeted into his stomach. An arrest at the Met Gala, a criminal record for corporate espionage against the Sinclairs. It would mean he wouldn't even be able to get that credit union teller job. He would be truly, permanently ruined, unemployable in any sector of the country. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes wide, his face a mask of raw, unadulterated terror. Eleanor looked at the broken, trembling man in front of her. 3 years ago, she would have cried for him. Tonight, she felt nothing but the chilling, liberating peace of absolute closure. The book was closed. The ledger was balanced. "No," Eleanor said softly, dismissing him entirely. "The police aren't necessary. Toss him out the rear service loading dock. Let him walk back to the PATH train in the sleet." She turned her back to him, lifting her champagne glass to Thomas Sterling, seamlessly resuming her conversation about the Austin project, as if Derek Hayes had never existed in the first place. "Eleanor, please, you can't leave me like this," Derek screamed, as the security guards suddenly took him by the elbows. Their grips were like industrial iron vices, lifting him completely off his feet, so his toes dragged against the ancient stone floor. "Eleanor." She didn't look back. Her father didn't look back. The billionaire socialites and European royalty turned their heads, politely pretending not to hear the desperate wails of a ruined man. As he was dragged backward through the opulent, golden-lit hall, past the magnificent ancient stones of the Egyptian temple, past the shimmering reflecting pool and the titans of industry, Derek realized the ultimate, horrifying truth. Richard Sinclair hadn't destroyed his life. Eleanor hadn't ruined his career. Derek Hayes had walked into a vault full of gold, complained bitterly about the lighting, and locked himself outside forever. The tragic irony of ambition is that it so often blinds us to the very wealth we already possess. Derek Hayes spent his life desperate to climb a ladder that was entirely artificial, worshipping the illusion of status while callously discarding genuine loyalty, love, and quiet brilliance. He learned too late that true value is rarely worn on the wrist or announced at a Michelin-starred restaurant. It is found in the quiet, steadfast character of those who stand by us when we have nothing. Eleanor's ultimate revenge was not in her financial retaliation, but in the devastating revelation of her own self-worth. In the end, the story serves as a stark, unforgiving reminder: never dismiss the people who quietly build you up, for you never know when they might reveal themselves to be the architects of the very world you are desperately trying to enter.